Only one practice in Miami because this is a sprint weekend. So it was a chaotic session, really. 1 hour, pretty hot, pretty humid, quite a lot of crosswind. And very early on, Charles Leclerc, about whom we spoke in the live stream, who needed to go to Miami without any drama at all after what happened last year, spun on only his second flying lap. And he spun at an innocuous corner as well. This wasn't the high-speed S's as we saw in previous years. This was coming out of turn 16, the very tight left-hander. He did well, actually, to keep his Ferrari between the guardrail. Didn't actually damage it, but got stuck in the middle of the road. Talk about inelegant. Stuck in the middle of the road. Couldn't get reverse gear. And that was his 1 hour session gone. A disaster for Charles, more than for Ferrari, because Carlos Sainz again did a very, very good job for Ferrari on the light fuel runs early on. He was quickest on the hard tyre. Wasn't quickest on the soft tyre right at the end, but he was out there doing a few long runs as well, putting in the homework and really doing all the donkey work for Ferrari, with Charles sitting in the pits doing nothing. Got to say right away, and get it out of the way for the weekend, Ferrari deciding to go with quite a lot of blue on the car, I guess partly to celebrate the arrival of HP as a major sponsor, but also because Miami blue, etc., etc. And I think they've just gone overboard with it. It would have been perfect had they just got the blue wheels, which they got, which look great, which is a nice touch with heritage as well. But all the other dabs of blue all over the car, particularly on the halo and other parts, looks very messy, I think. So it's a bit of a shame, a bit of a lost opportunity there, a bit over the top, which is unusual for Ferrari because normally their styling is pretty good in the Formula One context. Just go back to plain blue wheels. That's all we need. Thank you very much. Anyway, moving on. Very, very good session as predicted for Red Bull. Like everybody, they found it really difficult. These are the medium range of Pirelli tyres. Very slippery track at Miami right at the beginning of the weekend particularly. And Red Bull, like everybody, finding the car very difficult. Max describing the Pirellis as having to drive on eggshells. Mind you, he was the only driver out there, possible exception of the Mercedes drivers, really running a lot of fuel in this 1 hour session. He's the only driver really in a position to say what those Pirellis are like in full fuel race mode. And if they're on eggshells for Red Bull, they're going to be on eggshells for everybody else, that is for sure. But I don't think any of the other teams have really got to that fuel load yet to be able to make that sort of observation. So Max and Sergio Perez did a very good job in this first session with Red Bull, finding the circuit very difficult, but then everybody else did. And because they've got that large sweet spot about which I keep speaking, that they've got more room to maneuver in terms of setup and getting the car right, they made more use of that 1 hour session. Max did one run effectively. There was a bit of traffic early on medium tyres with light fuel. And then when Charles Leclerc had his spin and the track was red flagged for about 12 minutes, they took the opportunity to fill his car up with fuel, and Sergio Perez for that matter, fill his car up with fuel and do the long runs. Nobody else was doing that. Fernando Alonso didn't get out on soft tyres at the end for the soft tyre run that everybody inevitably was going to do at the end of this session in the build up to sprint qualifying. Fernando didn't even get out because he was late. He was kind of late throughout the session and he wanted to get in his fuel runs as well. And it just shows how to sync just in 1 hour two teams can be. And Aston Martin pretty much on the case. And I think more than anything, it highlights how organised Red Bull are. Even in this post-Adrian Newey's going to leave the team era, still look very, very sharp. Max complaining about crosswind. He did have a big moment, a sort of Charles Leclerc type 2023 moment going through the high-speed S's. But he came out of the lap, obviously, and backed away. But it was a crosswind moment. So it does affect Red Bull as much as it affects everybody else. Anyway, that was the basic picture. Let's have a look at some of the detail of what happened. These were the quickest times from the session. Fairly representative as we were going to go into sprint qualifying to see where all the teams lined up and who got it more or less right with setup and who didn't. And every time on soft tyres there, except Yuki Tsunoda, who was on the medium tyre. Really, really good job by Yuki to be as quick as that. Probably shows how much margin there is really at Red Bull at the front end, but nonetheless very good. And then I've got the top speeds as well. Those are not the top speeds as listed in the speed trap. Those are the top speeds they were actually doing on the lap on which they did their fastest lap. So they're more relevant, I think, and that will give them a better idea of where all the teams are in terms of how much downforce they're running, how quick they are on the straight, and what the lap time was. So Max quickest 28.5, 3.39. So we should remember that 3.39. If you look at Oscar Piastri, 3.36, 28.7, right at the end of this free practice session. Very good lap. Lando Norris at that point was in the pits, so no comparison there in terms of what he could do. But Oscar looked really good throughout the session. He hasn't got all the upgrades that Lando's got. Lando's got quite a lot of upgrades. Indeed, Mercedes have got a lot of upgrades here as well. And Oscar not running all of those, perhaps that gave him a freer run. I mean, Lando lost a little bit of time early on with the weighting of the power steering, and was very quick in the middle of the session when he did that time on hard tyres. And very quick in a straight line, although I suspect that represents some sort of toe and isn't realistic in terms of the McLaren's actual speed through the air. For that, I think you look at the Piastri time. Carlos Sainz, 28.7, 3.36. So you can see there 3 kilometers an hour slower. And I mentioned that one because presumably Ferrari are going to be one of the teams, if Red Bull aren't going to win, that are going to be in reasonable shape to do it. So 3 kilometers an hour on a light fuel load, with Max probably not getting the best from the car on that lap. I've got to say, it was just one lap. He had traffic, he had a moment, he had 2 laps of traffic, he had a moment. So by the time he did that time, the tyres were pretty worn and pretty hot anyway. 3 kilometres is quite a lot if you look at the lengths of the straight. So we shouldn't just say, oh, it's only 3 kilometres. It's 3 kilometres for a long time at terminal velocity here in Miami. George Russell, same top speed as Ferrari. Mercedes looking very good in terms of their upgrades and in terms of coming to the circuit with a reasonable setup. They must be pretty satisfied with the way things went in that 1 hour session. George Russell 28.7, same time as McLaren and Ferrari, you could say. These upgrades have taken maybe Mercedes up into that sort of territory on this sort of circuit anyway, and the top speed looks pretty reasonable as well. Lance Stroll putting in that quick lap while Fernando was doing the long runs. Quite good use of the 2 drivers there. The confidence they have in Stroll to be able to get out and do a quick time. It's probably the sort of confidence boost he needs at this stage of his career. Whereas Fernando, as I say, focusing on the longer runs. Good time by Lance Stroll, 28.8, 3.39, and quick on the straight, the Aston Martin. Right, evidence at the moment, not far away from Red Bull or thereabouts with Red Bull. You can see there Sergio Perez 3.40, so it does show how much margin Red Bull do have. That's very quick in the straight for Sergio Perez. Lewis Hamilton 3.34 by contrast. If you look at that difference, 6 kilometers an hour between Perez and Lewis Hamilton. Again, you've got to take into account that this is only free practice and maybe there was some traffic, maybe a bit of a tow involved, but that doesn't look that good for Mercedes if you look at the Lewis Hamilton times. Yuki Tsunoda, as I say, on the medium tyre, very good job, 29. But again, that kind of puts everything into perspective, really, in terms of how quick this track is going to get as it picks up grip on the soft tyre, 3.35. We've seen before that the Cash App is pretty quick in a straight line. This is I think one of the big stories so far in terms of the first session is that Alpine seem to have got the setup in terms of guesstimation not far away from their optimum. You can see Ocon and Gasly there. Pretty good in terms of lap time, not bad in terms of top speed. Looks like they're suffering a little bit in terms of top speed, but to be midfield, very unusual for Alpine. So got to say they seem to have got it right. Daniel Ricciardo a shade away from Yuki Tsunoda. The 2 Haas Ferraris, again, very good and reasonably quick in a straight line as well, as they've always been. Not as quick as the Williams, but there or thereabouts. And Lando Norris, as I say, didn't get out at the end to do a quick time, and nor did Fernando Alonso. So let's have a look at what they were doing on the long runs, how they compare. And not everybody was out there doing that, of course, because they were working away at trying to get the car sorted out for the 1 lap performance run going into sprint qualifying. But Max, you can see the homework that Max did compared with everybody else, and a lot of people didn't do any long runs at all with fuel in the car. So it just shows how on top of the game they are. And you know, if Max does turn out to be the winner of this Miami Grand Prix through sprint and then into the Grand Prix itself, a lot of it will be based on how much work he did in this 1 hour session, and just got in 1 quick lap early on, got the setup more or less right, and then went out and did that fuel run. And 32.9, 32.8, 32.7, 32.6, pretty consistent. And I've got at the bottom there in brackets the sort of average top speed they were doing on these fuel runs. There were a few anomalies which would have been tows in DRS, but taking those out of the picture, this gives a more accurate reflection, I think, of where they are in top speed, which will be very important in the race. Although there are, got to repeat it, there are 3 DRS zones in Miami, so there'll be a lot of DRS racing over the weekend, that is for sure. But anyway, 3.13 for Max when he was doing that run. Sergio Perez slightly quicker, which is what we often see these days. and slightly slower on average with fuel in the car. But very good homework there for the Red Bull engineers to be dissecting going into sprint qualifying. Now, let's have a look at Mercedes, because they did look good, and George Russell was out there doing what appeared to be long runs as well. And if you look at, he did one super quick time through the speed trap, which I've taken out of there, and I'm assuming that he did a few 306s. I'm assuming that's his real top speed. So there's the difference between Mercedes and Red Bull. Top speed quite clearly when you've got fuel in the car. In terms of the lap, not bad at all. You're looking at 32.1, 32.0 for George Russell. That's very quick compared with the Red Bulls, but look at the top speed difference, and in the race, of course, that's going to be significant. And it does mean that going into sprint qualifying even, let alone into the Grand Prix proper, and they're not going to Parc Ferme for the Grand Prix here, they're going to Parc Ferme for qualifying for the sprint race, so they can still make adjustments. If Red Bull have only got to take a little bit of wing out of that car, and you can see what's going to happen. They're not going to lose any downforce on that lap, that's for sure. So George Russell showing that Mercedes, yeah, they're quick on the lap, and Lewis Hamilton, again, 304, slightly slower than George in a straight line, but a big difference in top speed when you put fuel in the car. And in terms of his full tank runs, Lewis would be pretty happy with that, 32.0 as well, matching George's best. Matching George's best, so that's good for him. And then Fernando Alonso was out on hard tyres doing his long run. They gave him the option to come in towards the end. You know, if you're going to come in and do a soft tyre run at the end, Fernando, no, I stay out here, which is good. Shows he's confident in the setup, confident that he can go into sprint qualifying and get a quick lap out of the car. And look at that, on hard tyre, he's doing 32.2. That's not bad, is it? And 315, significantly quicker in a straight line than the Mercedes. And actually, you could say quicker than the Red Bulls, although I suspect, as I say, you're going to see a lot more top speed coming out of the Red Bulls going into qualifying. So there we are. That was free practice, but no one on the end of it, because it's the only one we'll have this weekend going into sprint qualifying, and then the sprint race, and then Grand Prix qualifying on Saturday. The Miami circuit looking pretty good in terms of all the stuff around there and the atmosphere. All the teams making a big effort to try and catch the flavour of this Miami Grand Prix, a very important race for Formula One. And it'll be interesting to see how Charles goes into the rest of the weekend now. He's definitely behind the music, but he's quite capable of getting in that car and putting in a lap time, of course, going into sprint qualifying. And a lot of that will be due to the hard work put in by Carlos Sainz, the driver that Ferrari have decided is no longer good enough to stay there, and they're going to get rid of him at the end of the year. I mean, that is just, well, it's tragic, really, isn't it? Anyway, that was the free practice this morning. Let's see what happens going into sprint qualifying. We'll have a second video out tonight to talk about that. See you then.